Hello, thanks for tuning in. The topic of this lecture is topic 4.5, Impact of Social Movements and Interest Groups. By the time we're through, we want to be able to explain how social movements and interest groups affect social and political change across the AP6 countries. Starting off with a few definitions here of key terms. Social movements involve large groups of people pushing collectively for significant political or social change. Interest groups are explicitly organized to represent and advocate for a specific interest or policy issue, while social movements represent multiple groups and individuals advocating for broad social change. So that's the key difference between those two terms. And then finally here, grassroots social movement. These are movements that exert their power up from the local to the regional, national, or international level. And quite often you'll hear grassroots movements being referred to as bottom-up movements. So now that we've defined our key terms, let's explore this key difference between social movements and interest groups in a little bit more detail. Social movements, again, represent multiple groups and individuals, while interest groups are more focused on a specific interest or policy issue. So let's look at some real-life examples in the United States to try to make sense of this. So a current social movement in the United States would be the Black Lives Matter movement. And the desire for that movement is sweeping social and political change for black populations in the United States. The movement is composed of large groups of people, and together, through protest movements, political action, etc., they're able to impact some type of sweeping change that's not specific to a single policy issue or a really specific group of people. Now, an example of an interest group would be the AARP, or the American Association of Retired People. The AARP is specifically and explicitly organized. It's a group of elderly individuals in the United States with a focus on policy issues facing retired persons, specifically Social Security. The difference between these two examples is that, unlike Black Lives Matter, the AARP requires dues, member registration, and they have specific leadership. Now let's take a look at the social movements in the AP6. Movements across the countries have put pressure on the state to promote indigenous civil rights, redistribute revenues from key exports such as oil, conduct fair and transparent elections, and to ensure fair treatment of citizens of different sexual orientations. So let's dig into this. So first, with Iran, the Green Movement was a social movement born out of the corruption identified in the 2009 presidential election. The goal of the Green Movement was to force the government into more transparent and fair elections. In addition to protests, the reformists also attempted to implement reform through legal processes and set up a new coalition called the Green Path of Hope. The goal of the coalition was to bring together NGOs, political parties, and social networks to ensure transparent elections and the rights promised under the Constitution. The Guardian Council did allow for a recount of 10% of the votes, but reported that they found no irregularities in the vote and dismissed all election complaints. Moving on to Mexico, the Zapatistas, or Chiapas uprising in Mexico, was a social movement in response to socioeconomic inequality and the negative impact of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, on indigenous peoples. The Zapatistas is classified as a social movement as it involved the call for work, land, housing, food, health, education, independence, liberty, democracy, justice, and peace for indigenous people. This is a wide sweeping list of demands for both political and social change, which is why it's classified as a social movement. In Mexico, the government responded to the pressure of the social movement by passing the Indigenous Rights Bill of 2001 that provides Indian groups preferential use of natural resources like wood and water in their territories to meet their own needs. The bill also guarantees the right to preserve and promote Indian languages and culture and the power to elect Indian officials according to customs that often involved a vote by an open assembly rather than by secret ballot. In Nigeria, there are two specific examples to be aware of. First of all, movements in Nigeria include the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta and the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, which have emerged to advocate for rights of an ethnic minority or protest against unjust methods of extraction and distribution of oil in the Niger Delta region. The MEND is a loose web of armed groups in Nigeria who use a variety of means to attack the oil industry in the area in order to bring about a larger share in the oil wealth for the Niger Delta. This group wants to change the social and economic standing of the people in the Niger Delta. The group is extremely disorganized, having recently split into one group that has accepted a ceasefire and another still attacking the oil industry and claiming to speak for all members of MEND. MOSOP is simply an umbrella organization of 11 different organizations fighting for social, economic, and environmental justice in the Niger Delta. Using nonviolent actions, the group has been able to bring international attention to the issues in the Delta with its protests against Shell Oil Company in the 1990s to try to put pressure on the government to enact change. The second major social movement is the Boko Haram movement, which is attempting to establish an Islamic State in northern Nigeria. It's another loosely organized military operation that is trying to put pressure on the Nigerian government to allow the group to create an Islamic State. The group has used a number of violent means, such as kidnappings, bombings, and assassinations, to put pressure on the national government. The government has responded with the use of military force in an attempt to eliminate the group, which continues to exist. And then, finally, with Russia, the Russian State Duma's passage of legislation against same-sex couples in 2013 led to massive democratic protests to change society and how it views same-sex couples. The protests are not led by a specific organization, but rather by loosely organized groups pushing for radical social change in the state. Protesters have been beaten and imprisoned, and the government has not changed any policies at this point. So let's dig in a little bit to grassroots movements. So this final key concept to discuss is grassroots social movements. And remember, they exert their power from the local level to the regional, national, or international level. The evidence of grassroots movements in the AP6 will really return to Nigeria as a key example here. So if you remember, if we get back to Nigeria, the MEND movement, this group is splintered. So even if the government wanted to negotiate with the group, you have one group within MEND that has stopped fighting and is willing to negotiate, but you have another segment of the group that is still attacking oil organizations and insisting it speaks for all members. So it makes this a grassroots movement, and this is something that's common with grassroots movement, is this fragmentation that takes place all the way down at the bottom, at the most local levels. And grassroots movements sometimes are difficult to negotiate with because the government doesn't necessarily know who to negotiate with. And that becomes a problem with actually trying to address concerns of the movement. And it makes it almost impossible to take actual action on the part of the government. All right, that is a wrap for topic 4.5, social movements in the AP6. Thanks for listening.